Hello again. There were many remarkable stories of democratic transition in the late 1980s and 1990s. Certainly the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and in several countries in Africa, as we saw in our last lecture. But it's hard to top South Africa. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was in prison, and no black South African could vote. 4 years later, he was elected president of the nation. Now, when we last focused on South Africa, we ended by noting that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, apartheid appeared to be in the saddle. The active opposition had been silenced. Mandela and a great number of his peers and cohorts jailed for life. His and other movements banned operating in exile, if operating at all. The government was pursuing its grand apartheid scheme of separate development based in the so-called homelands. The white population was prospering. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing for the rulers. A number of key factors and key steps led to South Africa's transformation. Let us examine them in turn. We can start with that period of the late 60s and early 70s, perhaps through the mid-70s, and observe that the quiet on the surface was deceptive. Black anger certainly was not diminishing, had not diminished, but it needed channeling in the place of resignation. A crucial development in this regard, especially among the younger black population, was the movement usually called Black consciousness. It bears some comparison with the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s in the United States, though bear in mind always, not just in this case, but in looking at history and politics in these countries in general, that we're talking, of course, about a black minority in one case and a majority in South Africa. Black consciousness in many respects was first and foremost a psychological movement. It called on black South Africans to free their minds first, to utterly reject the notions of inferiority the system handed them, to respect themselves and take pride in themselves, and pride in their capacity to change things themselves. There's a way in which there's an eerie echo in the Black consciousness movement with certain features of Afrikaner nationalism in, say, the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Afrikaner nationalists in those days had looked to their population, and of course I'm referring to the Dutch-descended white settlers in South Africa, and again said, have some respect for yourself. Don't let the stereotypes of, the bumpkin created by the British, in this case, saddle you with a perceived self-hatred or sense of inferiority. Stand up, be men and women, realize your pride in your capacity to change things. And of course, change things they did, particularly symbolized by the 1948 election. So Black consciousness and Afrikaner nationalism in some respects are at completely opposite ends of the spectrum. And yet, in this emphasis on psychological self-strengthening, they do bear certain similarities. Now, the preeminent spokesman of the Black consciousness movement was a brilliant and charismatic medical student named Bantu Steve Biko. It was Biko who looked at the average black South African around him and called him a hollow shell. And he called upon people to change that, to not allow the system to fill that hollowness with these senses of self-hatred and self-accepted versions of inferiority. Constantly harassed by the authorities, Biko, with his biting, incisive analyses and his, not least, steadfast humor, struck a chord with many, particularly the young. Let me give you an example of this. I'm going to paraphrase a scene which occurred in a courtroom during one of Biko's numerous trials on a variety of offenses. It was later brilliantly reenacted by Denzel Washington, no less, in the film Cry Freedom, based on the book by Donald Woods entitled Biko, and obviously about him. The screenplay was taken directly from the court transcript. Again, I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. Biko is on the stand, and the white South African judge at one point addresses him and says, Mr. Biko, why do you people refer to yourselves as black? You're not black, you're brown. And Biko quite calmly replies, and why do you people refer to yourselves as white? You're not white, you're a sort of off pink. Now, his point was that, of course, people distort and manipulate reality to construct so-called races. But his further point was, if you can proclaim white supremacy, don't tell me that I can't proclaim black consciousness. Now, in 1976, the cocksure government of South Africa made a classic blunder. It ordered that certain subjects be taught in Afrikaans in the secondary schools. Many objected to this proclamation on many grounds, but to the students themselves in the high schools, this was having the so-called, the quote, the language of the oppressor crammed down their throats. The outrage over the new policy led students in Soweto, South Africa's biggest township, to organize a rally and march. Large, but peaceful. You may recall the dichotomy which I put forward in Lecture 18, born really at the diamond mining town of Kimberley, between the mine and the compound initially. In other words, the point of production, if you like, and the place over there set apart and easily controlled, representing the black workforce. And I suggested at that point in that lecture that dichotomy really was enlarged and transposed and becomes a feature of virtually every urban place in South Africa, large or small. The town center, the city, and then over there, some distance away, easily surrounded, if not anymore actually fenced, was the township. The largest township in South Africa then was Soweto, which was actually an acronym and stood for Southwest Townships, lying about 6 to 10 miles southwest of downtown Johannesburg. Well, this was June 16th of 1976 when the rally against the new policy of classes being conducted in Afrikaans was held. The police responded to the students gathering as they had in Sharpeville in 1960 with gunfire. But this time it was not a one-off affair. In the days, the weeks, the months to come, the conflagration which began at Soweto spread throughout South Africa. Police battled defiant students. Hundreds, if not thousands, were killed. Townships were in flames. Well, something like order eventually returned, but a bit more than a year later, Steve Biko himself was arrested at a roadblock. In the next several days, he was beaten unconscious, thrown in the back of a Land Rover, a police Land Rover, and transported in the night over 600 miles up to Pretoria, where he died of brain damage. He'd been essentially murdered by the security forces. As you can imagine, his martyrdom had the result that South Africa erupted once again. Now, we've spoken before at several junctures in this course of watersheds, turning points, periods. Again, this is one of the great games that historians play. For my money, 1976 marks a watershed. From that date forward, I think it is a matter of when and not if the apartheid system will fall. Meanwhile, the African National Congress had been intensifying its military campaign against the regime, directed from exile, from bases abroad in Zambia, Angola, and Tanzania, above all. Many young people from the so-called generation of 76, a reference to the Soweto and accompanying demonstrations, the generation of 76 showing a spirit of 76, if you like. Many of them slipped across the borders, and this had the effect of greatly revitalizing the guerrilla forces. We recall that Mandela in 1960-61, in the wake of the bannings of the ANC, the Sharpeville massacre, etc., had of course led the turn of the oldest nationalist organization, the African National Congress, towards an embrace of armed warfare. And the organization Umkhonto weSizwe, or Spear of the Nation, was the military arm that I'm referring to when I talk about these attacks from exile. The ANC forces, again, bolstered by these new recruits, if you like, created by the events of 1976, a number of them, an increasing number of them, slipped back into South Africa, organizing attacks on police stations, on the Air Force headquarters, most dramatically in 1983, and on other targets like very posh, high-end shopping centers along the lush, Florida-like Natal coastline. Now, this aspect, this armed struggle aspect, if you'd like, was important in the South African transition. However, I think it's accurate to state, and I think it's important to state, that at no time did the ANC, let alone any other organization, have the strictly military capacity to, say, ride into Pretoria on tanks the way that, as we all know, in 1975, the North Vietnamese / Viet Cong did in Vietnam. So this is certainly an aspect, the military aspect, but it would have to be accompanied by a number of others to produce the change that eventually would come. Much more important than this low-level guerrilla conflict, in my view, was a state of, I would call it, civil insurrection, which eventually enveloped most of the townships, and indeed, occasionally, more than occasionally, slipped over into the legally whites-only town centers or city centers of South Africa. A state of civil insurrection driven by the so-called young comrades. That was their word for themselves. The youth activists who, in name, might be attached to the ANC, but often operated completely independently of it. The ANC, from its exile bases, had called for the comrades to make South Africa ungovernable, and in a lot of respects they did, but that doesn't mean that they did so at the direct instigation of, and let alone the direction of, the ANC itself. Indeed, they operated largely on their own and developed a momentum on their own. And let me say that the comrades' activities in creating civil insurrection were not always positive. They set up, for instance, so-called people's courts on their own, and in some cases, more than a few cases, what happened was that they hauled people whom they wanted to settle a score with. someone suspected on the slightest evidence of being a sellout or a stooge or what have you. Vendettas, in other words. They particularly enraged some of their elders, middle-class people or elderly people who were shocked at the notion that people who in many cases were teenagers were bringing them in and charging them with this or that violation. Now, for a moment, as I continue to put together some of these forces that lead to the dramatic transition, let me look back to the government policy unfolding in the 1980s. In a lot of respects, the 1980s can be referred to in South Africa, I would say, as the decade of neo-apartheid, of new apartheid. It was symbolized by the premiership of South Africa's penultimate, next to last, white leader, and that was Peter Botha, P.W. Botha, who, when he was elected president he was actually prime minister at that point, but when he was elected the leader of South Africa in 1978, one of his first pronouncements was that South Africa, in his words, must adapt or die. So Botha initiated a series of cautious reforms, some of them a bit more significant than others. He, in essence, did eliminate the hated passes, these identity booklets, which, of course, black South Africans had to carry to prove their right to be in a particular area, particularly an urban area, at any time. But the hollowness of Botha's attempts at reform and the ridicule with which they were greeted by a great number of the majority of the country is seen perhaps in his constitutional reforms of 1983. He put forth a new constitution with great fanfare and campaigned vigorously for it to obtain its passage in a whites-only referendum. And eventually it was passed by a margin of something like 60%. Now, his constitutional revision of 1983 would end the exclusively white parliaments that South Africa had had since 1910 and the creation of the country. Botha's new parliament would have three wings. It would have a white House of Parliament. It would have a so-called colored white House of Parliament. And remember that colored has a different meaning in South African history from black. This applied to approximately 9% of the population at that time. And it would have a third house for the Asian or Indian population, predominantly Indian population in South Africa, which constituted about 3% of the total. In other words, you now have a tripartite, still segregated parliament, open for the first time to people of color, if you like, but still excluding 75% of the population, which was comprised, of course, by the Bantu-descended black South Africans. They, as before, were to find their political destiny in the so-called homelands. Now, one of Botha's reforms was to legalize black labor unions. And this was probably undertaken in the hope of ending what were increasing numbers of wildcat strikes and unannounced walk-offs and so forth. The notion of legalizing them in the hope, perhaps, of obtaining some greater structure and control over them. Like so many reforms we've seen in other contexts in this course, it backfired. The labor movement increasingly flexed its muscle, and of course this was an enormous amount of power precisely because South Africa at no time had ever ended its great dependency upon black labor. Okay, finally, the international community increasingly stepped up the pressure on South Africa. The 1980s was the time when popular songs like Biko by Peter Gabriel or We Don't Do Sun City, a reference to the casinos located in one of the so-called homelands and so on. All over the world, there were free Mandela festivals, often employing music and performance, as well as a variety of high-profile participants. More seriously, perhaps, or at least more substantively, this was the age of sanctions. And by sanctions, I mean the application of economic pressure above all. In other words, sanctions can take many, many forms. But the notion of the boycott, either voluntary or imposed and required by government laws. For instance, the notion that krugerrands, the 1 ounce coins made of pure gold, that it would become illegal to purchase those and so forth. So again, sanctions could take a whole variety of forms. This was the time when students in American universities often called upon their boards of trustees to withdraw the university's endowments from companies that did business in South Africa. It was the time when banks, quite on their own, would often begin to withdraw capital because of their fears of an impending blow-up and a loss of order in South Africa. The sanctions began to take a toll, and one crucial turning point came in 1985-86 when the United States Congress overrode President Reagan's veto, and the United States added its muscle then to a whole variety of countries around the globe applying these sanctions, which again began to actually be felt inside South Africa itself. So I've isolated 4 basic factors that I think coalesce in the 1980s and propel us towards the enormous changes that began to unfold at the end of that decade. A low-level guerrilla war, a state of civil insurrection in and around the townships, a rapidly increasing exhibition of power, application of power on the part of trade unionists and black labor unions, and finally an international application of pressure in the form of sanctions. All of these factors together began to convince certain figures in the inner circle of South African power, rather like it had in the old Soviet Union, that the system could not go on like this. They began to advocate reaching out and forging some sort of compromise. And who better to seek out than the symbol of the opposition, residing in one of their prisons, of course, and that was Mandela. Now, for his part, Mandela had been thinking along similar lines. You might say better gain without war than more war without gain. So he began to accept the notion of negotiation and compromise more than his colleagues, at least publicly, embraced from their exile bases. He cultivated several reformist figures in the inside of the power structure, and he did so from inside his different and steadily more conducive prison environs. He was actually shifted from Robben Island to a second and eventually to a third prison under far better conditions, and it was from there that he began these negotiations. Now, P.W. Botha, the president in 1989, invited him that year to have tea at Town House, the place where the president stays when he's in the city of Cape Town, just next to the parliament there. I was in South Africa when this occurred, and it was an electrifying moment. The notion that the president of South Africa would sit down for a talk with Nelson Mandela was indeed a very substantial and hugely symbolic departure. Now, shortly later, Botha suffered a stroke, and he was replaced by F.W. de Klerk, Frederick de Klerk, precisely one of the inner circle reformists that we mentioned a moment ago. De Klerk, I think, actually can be compared at a number of places, at a number of points, with Mikhail Gorbachev of the old Soviet Union. After all, both of them had been sort of loyal party members and party servants, party officials. They had worked themselves up by showing competence within the older structures of the state and party. But both were exceptionally perceptive men, and Again, as I put it before, they realized that the system could not go on the way that it had. Now, in his unforgettable speech of February 1990, de Klerk, in his opening of Parliament at that point, freed Mandela, legalized all political parties, including the ANC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Communist Party, and so forth. And with that speech, he forever changed South African politics. I think it's important to realize that Mandela took a very considerable risk in doing what he did from prison with only sporadic and incomplete communication with the exiled leadership of the ANC. Many in the ANC opposed this course. They wanted to continue and step up the pressures that we've mentioned before. And it's quite conceivable that Mandela could have wound up marginalized in this whole transitional story, as opposed to occupying the place at its very center. Now, South Africa was hardly out of the woods after the legalization of political parties, the freeing of Mandela and other political prisoners. There ensued an incredibly tense and indeed very violent period preceding the general elections of April 1994. It seemed at various stages like this whole process of transition was a bit like a very old train on a very old set of tracks, and that it wobbled from side to side and at any moment might indeed tip over and produce a complete stop to the whole process. There were rumors and possibilities of military coups on the part of the white South African military. There was a huge conflict between essentially the followers of the ANC and the followers of what I would call a Zulu nationalist movement, Inkatha, later known as the Inkatha Freedom Party. And this resulted in a tremendous amount of carnage, particularly in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, the areas around Durban, South Africa, and so forth. So there were a lot of ways in which this thing could have been derailed, and which would have raised a whole different kind of future and reality in South Africa. Now, as the whole world knows, though, the elections did come in April of 1994. The images of it are still striking. You know, the lines snaking around many blocks where you see whites and blacks standing next to each other in a line to vote. The old women and men showing up in wheelchairs who are, 80 or 90 years of age and voting for the first time in their life. It's still a moment that packs a great deal of emotive power. As we know, Mandela and his party won that election and became the ruling party, the government of the new South Africa. Since that time, South Africa has certainly been beset by its share of problems. Millions of its people suffer from the HIV/AIDS virus. It has a very serious problem with violent crime. Some suggest that South Africa's old racial structure has simply been replaced with a class structure. Nonetheless, among other things, South Africa has enjoyed essential and basic stability. It has conducted more open and peaceful elections. It has experienced positive economic growth. There are those who scoff at the term South African miracle. I don't. If you want an alternative possibility, consider that represented by Israel/Palestine. Is it conceivable that we could have seen in South Africa a seemingly endless cycle of rocket attacks, draconian government sweeps and crackdowns, suicide bombings? From the perspective of the 1980s, that was entirely conceivable. What did happen was something very different. that still strikes me as miraculous.